Good evening. Let's start with what is actually on the page, a White House financial disclosure form, filed, public, dense with numbers. Late in the year 2025, according to that disclosure, President Donald Trump reported a series of financial transactions, not one or two, a lot of them. The form shows a total of 191 separate financial transactions. That is the number, 191. And among them, the disclosure reflects purchases of corporate and municipal bonds. The total value listed for those bond purchases, up to $51 million. That is not a rounded figure pulled from interpretation. That is the reported range on the disclosure itself, up to $51 million. Now, these purchases were reported as occurring late in 2025. The document does not list commentary. It does not offer explanation. It simply records the transactions. Included among those bond purchases were investments tied to major media companies. Specifically, the disclosure lists up to $2 million in bonds associated with Netflix. It also lists bonds tied to Discovery Communications. These are bond investments, not equity shares, not stock purchases, just bonds. That distinction matters because the form is precise about what was purchased. The timing of these purchases is also clearly indicated. They were made after Netflix announced plans involving Warner Bros. Discovery. That announcement made publicly by Netflix outlined plans to acquire Warner Bros. Discovery studio assets and HBO assets. The disclosure does not say more than that. It does not expand on intent, but it does establish sequence. Announcement first, bond purchases after. The form itself is methodical, line after line, transaction after transaction, corporate bonds, municipal bonds, and then the totals. Up to $51 million across those categories. There is no commentary attached to the form explaining strategy. There is no explanation of why these particular bonds were selected. There is no description of motivation. There is also no comment from the White House on these purchases. That absence is noted. The disclosure records the transactions, and that is where it stops. You know, sometimes paperwork speaks in a very quiet voice, but it still speaks. The disclosure does not elevate one transaction over another. It lists them evenly. Netflix bonds appear alongside others. Discovery Communications bonds are listed without elaboration. They sit among dozens and dozens of reported transactions, 191. That is the scope, and the total amount tied to bonds taken together reaches that reported upper limit, up to $51 million. Now, the document is not an investigative finding. It is not an allegation. It is a required filing. It exists so that the public can see financial activity as reported by the filer. Nothing more, nothing less. The disclosure also does not clarify the exact dollar amount of each bond purchase beyond ranges. That is how these forms are structured. They show brackets, not precise figures. So when the form says up to $2 million tied to Netflix-related bonds, that is the range provided. It does not specify the exact dollar within that range. Same with the overall total, up to $51 million, a ceiling, not a pinpoint. And still, the information is there, plainly, in black and white, late 2025. Corporate and municipal bonds, Netflix, Discovery Communications, and a public disclosure noting it all. There is a line that sometimes comes to mind when documents like this surface. It's not about accusation, it's about clarity. This is what the paper says. That's it, that's the starting place. No comment from the White House accompanied the disclosure. That is stated directly. No clarification was provided at the time the form became public. So what we have at this point is the disclosure itself, the numbers it contains, the timing it records, and the fact that it exists at all. Because disclosures like these are meant to be read slowly, carefully. And when you read this one, what you see is a late-year snapshot of financial activity, recorded formally, submitted as required. It doesn't shout. It doesn't explain itself. It just sits there, waiting to be understood. There's something grounding about a document that doesn't argue back. That's where we begin. When you move past the headline number, when you move past that upper figure of up to $51 million, what you are left with is the structure of the disclosure itself. Because that form does not dramatize, it itemizes. Each transaction is listed individually. Each one occupies its own line. There are corporate bonds. There are municipal bonds. They are presented without hierarchy. One transaction does not announce itself as more significant than another. They simply accumulate. And by the time you reach the end of the document, the total number of entries reaches 191. That is not a symbolic number. It is a count. The disclosure does not indicate that all of those transactions occurred on the same day. It does not say they were part of a single decision. It just records them as transactions that took place, reported together. Among them, certain names stand out because they are familiar to the public. Netflix, Discovery Communications. Those names appear in connection with bond purchases. Again, bonds. The disclosure does not indicate ownership stakes. It does not indicate voting power. It does not indicate control. It indicates debt instruments, up to $2 million tied to Netflix-related bonds. That is what the form reflects. The same form lists bonds tied to Discovery Communications. It does not embellish. It does not contextualize. Now, the timing matters only because the form includes it. Late 2025. The document shows that these purchases were made after Netflix publicly announced plans related to Warner Brothers Discovery Studio assets and HBO assets. That sequence is clear. Announcement first, purchases after. The disclosure does not state that the announcement caused the purchases. It does not state that the purchases responded to the announcement. It simply records that the purchases occurred after. This is important because the disclosure is not written to draw conclusions. It is written to document. And documentation has a particular rhythm. It is steady. It is restrained. Each entry follows the same format. Asset type, general value range. No adjectives, no justifications. And then at the end, the totality of it becomes visible, up to $51 million in corporate and municipal bonds. That is the aggregate range reported. Now, the disclosure also makes clear what it does not include. It does not include commentary from the filer. It does not include explanatory notes. And notably, it does not include a response from the White House. The summary accompanying the disclosure states that no comment was provided by the White House on the purchases. That absence is not framed as unusual. It is simply stated, no comment, which leaves the document to stand on its own. You know, there's a moment when you're reading something like this and you realize the document is doing exactly what it is designed to do. It is not trying to persuade. It is not trying to deflect. It is complying. And compliance has a certain quiet authority to it. The disclosure form exists because it must exist. It is required. It captures financial activity within a defined period. It records it in standardized ranges. It does not care whether the names listed are familiar or obscure. It treats them all the same. Netflix appears in the same format as every other entry. So does Discovery Communications. There is no separate section for media-related investments. There is no special emphasis. They are part of the larger set. 191 transactions. That is the frame. And within that frame, up to $51 million in bond purchases. The form does not say whether these were long-term holdings. It does not say whether they were short-term. It does not say whether they were part of a broader strategy. It does not say whether they replaced other assets. It simply lists them. And sometimes that's all a document can do. There is a temptation when you see recognizable names to read beyond the text, but the text resists that. It stays where it is. Netflix announced plans to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery Studio and HBO assets. That announcement is public. After that announcement, the disclosure shows bond purchases tied to Netflix and Discovery Communications. Those are the facts as recorded. Nothing in the form suggests coordination. Nothing in the form suggests intent beyond purchase, and nothing in the form expands on context. It is worth sitting with that restraint for a moment, because in an environment where commentary is constant, a document that refuses to comment feels almost unfamiliar. It doesn't argue its own significance. It doesn't highlight implications. It just exists. There's a strange honesty in paperwork that refuses to perform. That line keeps coming back. The disclosure also does not isolate the Netflix and Discovery bonds as the majority of the total amount. They are part of the total, up to $2 million in bonds tied to Netflix. That is a fraction of the up to $51 million total. The rest of the amount is spread across other corporate and municipal bonds. Again, 191 transactions. The document makes no claim that these investments were unusual. It does not compare them to previous years. It does not say whether the number is higher or lower than past disclosures. It simply records what happened. Late in 2025. That is the time frame. And the absence of White House comment stands as its own line in the summary. No elaboration, no follow-up, just the fact of it. In this way, the disclosure functions almost like a ledger. It records movement. It does not interpret. And that leaves interpretation outside the document, which is why reading it carefully matters. Because every detail it contains is deliberate, and every detail it omits is just as deliberate. The disclosure includes numbers, it includes names, it includes timing, it does not include motive, it does not include narrative. That is not a flaw, that is the design. And when you read it that way, you begin to see it not as a headline, but as a record of transactions, a record of compliance, and a record that stands quietly on its own. There are moments when silence is not empty, it's just complete. And with that understanding of what the disclosure shows and how it shows it, we can now move toward what it leaves behind. By the time you reach the end of the disclosure, there is no twist waiting for you, no reveal tucked into the final lines. What remains is the same thing that was present at the beginning. A document, filed, complete. It tells you that late in 2025, President Donald Trump reported purchasing corporate and municipal bonds. It tells you that the total value of those bond purchases reached up to $51 million. It tells you that among those transactions were bonds tied to Netflix and Discovery Communications, up to $2 million connected to Netflix-related bonds. It tells you that these purchases occurred after Netflix announced plans to acquire Warner Bros. Discovery Studio and HBO assets, and it tells you that there were 191 financial transactions in total. That is the full accounting as presented. Nothing in the disclosure elevates one transaction above the others. Nothing in the disclosure flags any purchase as exceptional. The Netflix-related bonds appear in the same format as every other entry. So do the Discovery Communications bonds. They are recorded because they must be recorded. They are disclosed because disclosure is required. The form does not editorialize. It does not offer justification. It does not anticipate reaction. And it does not respond to questions that are not asked within its margins. The absence of White House comment is noted plainly. No comment was provided. That sentence stands alone. It is not followed by explanation. And in a way, that absence reinforces the nature of the document itself. This is not a press release. This is not a statement. It is a filing. The form exists to meet an obligation. It meets that obligation by listing transactions within defined ranges, up to $2 million, up to $51 million. Those phrases matter because they define the boundaries of what is being reported. The disclosure does not claim precision where it is not required. It uses ranges. And those ranges are part of the standardized structure. Late 2025 is the time frame, not a single day, not a single moment. The disclosure does not break the transactions down by week or by hour. It does not narrate sequence beyond what is necessary. It tells you what happened and when in the broadest required terms. Netflix announced its plans involving Warner Brothers Discovery Studio and HBO assets. That announcement is acknowledged. After that announcement, bond purchases tied to Netflix and Discovery Communications were made. That sequence is recorded. The disclosure does not say why. It does not say how those decisions were made. And importantly, it does not say anything about the significance of those announcements in relation to the purchases. It simply places them on the same timeline. The form also does not suggest that these bond purchases were unique within the broader set of transactions. They are part of a total of 191. The remaining transactions are not described in detail in the summary. They are present in the disclosure itself. Corporate bonds, municipal bonds. Together, they add up to the reported total range. When you sit with that, what becomes clear is that the disclosure is not asking to be interpreted beyond its contents. It is not inviting inference. It is not framing a narrative. It is offering transparency in its most basic form. Numbers, names, dates, and the rest is left outside the document. You know, there is a moment when you realize that some documents are not meant to answer questions. They are meant to establish a record. This is what happened. That is all they say. The disclosure does not argue its own importance. It does not claim relevance beyond compliance. And yet, because it is public, because it is required, it becomes part of the public record. That is its function. The White House provided no comment on the purchases. That fact is included. No additional clarification accompanies the filing. No supplementary statement appears. And so the disclosure stands as the sole source of information on these transactions. It does not attempt to contextualize the Netflix announcement beyond acknowledging its timing. It does not elaborate on the Warner Brothers Discovery Studio and HBO assets beyond naming them. It does not describe the structure of the acquisition. It does not describe its implications. Those details are not part of this document, and that boundary is important, because when you respect the boundaries of a disclosure, you allow it to be what it is, a record. Late 2025, up to $51 million in corporate and municipal bonds, up to $2 million tied to Netflix-related bonds, bonds tied to Discovery Communications, 191 financial transactions, no comment from the White House. Those are the facts, as reported. Nothing in the disclosure suggests error. Nothing in the disclosure suggests correction. It is filed, it is public, and it is complete. There is a tendency sometimes to look for meaning in the margins, to read between lines that are not written. But this document does not offer margins wide enough for that. It is tightly structured, intentionally limited. And in that limitation, it is precise. There's a certain stillness to the truth when it's written down and left alone. That stillness is what remains here. The disclosure does not tell you what to think. It does not tell you what to feel. It tells you what was reported, and then it stops, which means that when the numbers settle, when the names are read, when the totals are tallied, what remains is exactly what was disclosed. Nothing more, nothing less.